Dr. Michael Harper didn't believe in luck, only precision. Inside the cardiac wing of St. Luke's Hospital, everything was measured, rehearsed, predictable. His hands moved steady above the patient's open chest, instruments gleaming beneath the surgical lights. Around him, a team of younger doctors followed his pace, quick, silent, obedient. "Clamp," he said. "Clamp," came the echo. "Pressure holding. Good. Let's close." When it was over, he peeled off his gloves, stepped back, and glanced at the monitor. Another heart beating because he told it to. Another day, he'd done his job perfectly. Outside, in the hallway, the world felt different. No rhythm, no order, just noise. Nurses laughed near the elevator. A janitor hummed under his breath. Harper ignored them all, heading to his office where the blinds were always half-drawn. On the desk lay a photo. His wife, Elizabeth, smiling beside a young man in a graduation robe. The frame had a thin layer of dust. He looked at it only for a second before turning it face down, the same way he'd turned the page on his son's life years ago. He remembered the argument like it was yesterday, not the words. Those had blurred with time, but the silence that followed them. It was a summer afternoon. The house still smelled of coffee and cut grass. Nick was home from his first year of college, and Michael had been waiting for the right moment to ask how anatomy classes were going. "They're not," Nick had said, eyes steady. "I switched majors." Michael had laughed, thinking it was a joke. "Switched? To what?" Nick hesitated only a second. "Art history." The air changed. The ceiling fan hummed, the clock ticked, and somewhere outside a lawnmower sputtered to life. Normal sounds that suddenly felt foreign. "Art history," Michael repeated. "You're joking." "I'm not." He'd said things then he couldn't take back. About wasting potential, about throwing away everything he'd worked for. And Nick had stood there, quiet, pale, until finally he said, "Dad, it's my life." Michael had wanted to reply, but the words tangled with pride and fear and came out as anger instead. When the door closed behind Nick, the house went still. And in that stillness, something far bigger than an argument ended. It had been 3 years since that day. The photo of Nick still sat on the bookshelf in the living room, half hidden behind a row of medical journals. Elizabeth never moved it, but she never dusted it either. "Michael," she said one evening, her voice low, the way people talk before saying something they know won't be heard. He called. He didn't look up from his notes. "Who?" "Your son," she said softly. Michael underlined a line in the patient chart, pretending to read. "And he wanted to tell you he got a job at the museum. He's curating a small exhibit next month." "That's nice," he said flatly. "Maybe one day he'll paint something useful." Elizabeth sighed, not angry, just tired. "You don't have to agree with his choices, but you could be proud of him." Michael looked at her then, the lines around his eyes deeper than before. "Pride is for people who settle." He could have saved lives. She met his gaze. Maybe he's saving something else. He didn't answer, just turned off the lamp, leaving the room in shadow. That night, as he lay awake, he realized the silence in the house wasn't punishment anymore. It had become routine. The hospital hadn't changed in 20 years. Same gray corridors, same coffee that tasted like metal. But Michael had. He noticed it in small things. The weight in his knees when he stood too long. The tremor that came only after surgeries, not during them. He walked the hall in his usual pace, brisk, precise, untouchable. Nurses smiled politely. Younger doctors straightened their posture when he passed. He was still the man people admired, maybe even feared a little. In the operating room, though, something had shifted. The focus was there, the steadiness too, but the joy, the old rush of purpose, was gone. He'd become a man who could fix hearts but not feel much with his own. After the operation, he washed his hands longer than usual. The cold water stung. In the mirror, his reflection looked older than he remembered. "Good work today, Dr. Harper," said one of the interns. He nodded, forcing a smile. Good work keeps people alive. Nothing more. Later, sitting in his car, he rested his hands on the steering wheel. For the first time, the silence didn't calm him. It just reminded him who wasn't there to fill it. Elizabeth waited until after dinner. She learned over the years that Michael was most human when the day was done, When the sharpness of the hospital finally wore off and his shoulders softened just a little, they sat in the living room, she knitting, he reading medical reports that he pretended still interested him. Outside, the rain drummed softly against the windows. "Michael," she said after a while, without looking up. "I talked to Nick. He didn't move, but she saw the way his fingers stopped turning the page. He's getting married," she added. The room went quiet. The only sound was the clock ticking over the fireplace. Finally he said, "To who?" "A woman named Claire. She teaches art. He wants us to be there." He exhaled through his nose, slow, controlled, surgical. "Elizabeth." She set down her knitting. "He doesn't want a scene. He just wants his father there. That's all." Michael leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. "You make it sound simple." "It is," she said softly. "You just have to show up." He didn't answer, but the way his eyes flicked toward the framed photo on the shelf told her he was already thinking about it. That night, long after Elizabeth went to bed, Michael stayed in his chair, the house quiet except for the rain ticking on the windows. He let his eyes wander to the shelf across the room, to that same old photo of Nick in his graduation robe, the one he used to keep turned face down. He picked it up this time. Nick had been smiling, wide and unguarded, a mix of pride and hope. He remembered the day, the handshake, the photograph, the thought that his son was finally stepping into his footsteps. Funny how a single step could turn into a lifetime of distance. He leaned back, holding the picture with both hands, tracing the edge of the frame with his thumb. He wondered when exactly the disappointment had turned into absence. Maybe it was easier to stay angry than to admit he'd lost him. Down the hall, a floorboard creaked. The house made its small night sounds, familiar and steady. For the first time in years, Michael realized he didn't know what Nick's voice sounded like anymore. He whispered his son's name, just to hear it out loud, and the silence that followed felt heavier than ever. The next morning, Michael was back in the operating wing before sunrise. He liked the quiet before the rush, the hum of fluorescent lights, the smell of antiseptic, the illusion that the world could still be controlled if you started early enough. His first surgery went as planned. His second, too. By noon, he'd already saved 2 lives and said almost nothing all day. In the break room, a young surgeon named Patel was pouring coffee. He was new, eager, polite, still believing in happy endings. "Big day tomorrow," Patel said. Michael looked up from his notes. "For you." "My daughter's school play," he said, smiling. "She's a cloud." Michael gave a small nod. "A cloud," he repeated, unsure what else to say. "Yeah," Patel laughed. "Can't miss it. My wife says it's 5 minutes long, but it's the most important 5 minutes of her year." Michael forced a small smile, pretending to understand. But as Patel left, he stared at the empty doorway. The hum of the vending machine filled the room, the sound oddly loud. He realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd chosen something, anything, over work. And for the first time, that didn't feel like discipline. It felt like failure. When he got home, the house smelled of roasted chicken and thyme, Elizabeth's quiet ritual for hard days. She didn't ask about his surgeries. He didn't ask about hers. That was their peace treaty after 40 years of marriage, silence where the world was too loud. On the kitchen counter lay an envelope, cream-colored, handwritten, his name in neat, deliberate letters, Dr. Michael Harper. Elizabeth stood by the sink, drying her hands. "It came today," she said softly. "From Nick." He looked at it, the weight of it, the shape, as if it were a patient file that might explode. "I didn't open it," she added. "But I think you should." Michael nodded once, said nothing, and picked it up. He carried it into his study, closing the door behind him. The room smelled of old paper and disinfectant, a place where even dust seemed disciplined. He set the envelope on his desk beside the framed photo of his medical team and sat down. For a long time, he just stared at it, his fingers hovering but not touching. Then he turned off the lamp, left the envelope unopened, and walked out. Even he didn't know why. He hadn't meant to see it. The TV in a hospital lounge was usually tuned to news or sports, background noise for people waiting between emergencies. But that afternoon, during his lunch break, a segment caught his eye, The Art of Modern Stillness, filmed at the City Museum. He was halfway through his sandwich when he heard the name. Nicholas Harper, curator. His hand froze. On the screen, Nick stood in front of a pale blue canvas, talking about light and silence. His voice was calm, assured, the tone of a man who'd found his place. He says art teaches people to pause, the reporter added. Michael leaned forward, barely breathing. Nick gestured toward the painting, explaining how every brushstroke was about what's not there, the space between things. It was the same way Michael used to talk about surgery, the rhythm, the precision, the quiet between heartbeats. He didn't notice when the sandwich slipped from his hand. For years, he'd convinced himself Nick had chosen the easy way out. But watching him now, composed, thoughtful, alive, Michael understood. His son had chosen a different kind of healing. And maybe, in some strange way, he'd learned it from him. That evening, Elizabeth found him in the living room, sitting in the dark. The TV was off, but the remote rested in his lap, like he'd been holding it for a while. She stood by the doorway. "You didn't eat." He nodded slightly. "Not hungry." For a moment she hesitated, then came closer. "Rough day." He exhaled slowly, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "I saw him," he said. Elizabeth froze. "Nick?" He nodded again, eyes on the floor. "On television. At the museum." She waited, letting the silence stretch. He was talking about a painting. Michael continued. About silence. About how people need to stop and just look. He gave a faint, tired laugh. "Never thought he'd be the one teaching me that." Elizabeth sat beside him, her hand brushing his sleeve. "He still wants you there, Michael?" he asked. "I know," he said quietly. "You're not angry anymore," she said. Not a question, more like an observation. He shook his head. "No, just late." She smiled gently. "Late is still better than never." He didn't answer, but his hand closed around hers, steady, deliberate, as if relearning how to hold something fragile. When the house went quiet again, Michael returned to his study. The envelope was still there, right where he'd left it, a pale rectangle of patience waiting on the desk. He sat down slowly, as if not to startle it. The lamp light caught the edges of the paper, and for a second he thought about leaving it sealed forever. Some wounds, he'd learned, stayed cleaner if he didn't reopen them. But then he thought of Nick's voice from the interview, calm, confident, alive, and of Elizabeth's words echoing in his head. Late is still better than never. He picked up a letter opener and slid it carefully along the edge. Inside was a simple card. "Nick and Claire invite you to share this day with them. Saturday, 2 p.m., the Oak Garden, Willow Street. No guilt, no apology, no plea. Just an invitation." He read it twice, then folded it back into the envelope. His fingers lingered on his name, Dr. Michael Harper, written in his son's familiar handwriting. For the first time in years, it didn't feel like a title. It felt like forgiveness waiting for an answer. Saturday morning came gray and heavy with spring rain. Michael had no surgery scheduled, a rare weekend off. He made coffee, read the paper, check the weather forecast, everything in perfect order. But the house felt too quiet, like it was holding its breath. Elizabeth had gone out early to run errands, leaving him alone. The envelope still lay on his desk upstairs, a silent reminder. He tried reading an article about new surgical procedures, but found himself staring at the same paragraph for 10 minutes. He turned on the radio, then off again. The ticking of the clock felt louder than usual. He went for a walk, his usual route through the park near the hospital. Trees were budding, rain dripping off branches, people passing with umbrellas. A father and son tossed a football across the damp grass. He stopped for a moment, watching them. The boy laughed as the ball slipped through his hands. The father just smiled, tossed it again. Michael felt something twist gently in his chest. Not pain exactly, but something close. By the time he got home, the rain had stopped. He hung up his coat, glanced at the clock. The ceremony would be starting soon, and he still hadn't decided. The Oak Garden was easy to find. A quiet place tucked behind an old church, with ivy climbing the stone walls and rows of white chairs set under blooming trees. Michael parked across the street, engine still running. The faint sound of music drifted through the rain-damp air. Soft piano, laughter, voices. He sat there for a long time, hands resting on the wheel. Through the windshield, He could see people gathering, umbrellas opening and closing, flashes of color and motion. Then, for a brief moment, he saw him. Nick, standing near the front, straightening his tie, smiling nervously as a woman in a white dress took his hand. Michael swallowed hard. His first instinct was to start the car, to drive away before anyone noticed. He'd missed too many years, said too many wrong things. Showing up now felt almost selfish, like arriving late to a story that had already ended. But then he remembered Nick's voice on the TV. Art is about stillness, about what's not said. He turned off the engine. For a few seconds, he just sat there, listening to the sound of his own heartbeat. Then he opened the door and stepped into the rain. The ceremony had already ended when he reached the garden. Guests stood in small circles, talking, laughing, glasses of champagne catching the afternoon light. The rain had stopped, leaving the grass damp and shining. Michael stood at the edge for a moment, unnoticed. He could see Nick near the arbor, his arm around Claire, both smiling for photos. They looked happy. Honestly, quietly happy. Elizabeth caught sight of him first. Her eyes widened, but she didn't say a word, just smiled, small and knowing. Nick turned at that exact moment. For a heartbeat, they just stared at each other. No anger, no distance, only the shock of recognition after too many years apart. Then Nick stepped forward, hesitated, and said softly, "You came." Michael nodded, his throat tight. "I did." They stood like that, the crowd fading into a blur of color and sound. "I wasn't sure if I should," Michael admitted. "But your mother said it's never too late to show up." Nick smiled, not wide, not dramatic, just enough. "Thank you," he said. Michael exhaled, something in him finally letting go. "Congratulations, son." And when their hands met, it wasn't a handshake. It was a beginning. The guests were already drifting toward the reception hall when Michael found Nick alone by the oak tree. The music played softly in the distance, laughter blending with the rustle of leaves. Michael held a small envelope in his hand, plain, unadorned, like everything he owned. "I wanted to give you something," he said. Nick smiled, a little uncertain. "You didn't have to." "I did," Michael interrupted gently, and handed him the envelope. Inside were two things, a set of keys and a folded document. Nick unfolded the paper slowly. "Dad, this is the clinic." Michael nodded. "It's empty now. Needs work, but the light's good in the afternoons." Nick looked up, eyes wide. "You're giving it to me?" "I'm not giving," Michael said quietly. "I'm letting go. It's yours, to do what you want. Gallery, studio, whatever it becomes." Nick's voice caught. "You're sure?" For the first time, Michael said, smiling faintly, yes. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Nick stepped forward and hugged him, the way sons hug fathers when words would only make it smaller. And as the music swelled in the distance, Michael realized control had built his life, but letting go had finally made a hole.